Good afternoon, Sue.
Jimmy Lynn, it's so good to see you.
It's nice to see you too. Today is August the 17th, 2021. Did you ever think you'd get to the year 2021?
No, and I have to say it's awe-inspiring to realize that I'm old enough to do one of these interviews now.
I certainly, there are many people who felt the same way. Think of it as you're experienced enough to
I like that better.
be invited to give your oral history because of all the experiences you've had through your life and your career. So you are Susan Laurie Kay, that's your full name, and you are a lawyer here in Nashville, Tennessee. I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about your background. If you would start from where you were born and tell us a little bit about your grandparents, because there's some interesting background there.
My mother's parents immigrated here from the Ukraine in 1921, and my mother was born in 1923 in New York City.
So you're a second generation.
So I'm second generation. She spoke Yiddish at home. English was her second language, although you wouldn't know it by the time I knew her.
Now, did she teach you Yiddish?
No, but she and my aunt, if they wanted they wanted the kids not to know what they were speaking about, would talk in Yiddish so that they could talk about people's affairs or whatever that they didn't want us to know about.
Or Hanukkah presents or
exactly.
Whatever. They had their own secret language.
Exactly.
Yes. And so where were you born?
I was born in Brookline, Massachusetts. And actually, August 17th is a really important day in my life because that was the day I was adopted.
Okay.
So I was born in Brookline, Massachusetts. My parents lived in Pittsfield.
Okay.
And from the time I was 6 months old when I was adopted until I came here, I lived in Pittsfield, Massachusetts.
Wonderful. So you were adopted when you were 6 months old.
Yes.
All right. And you've never known your birth parents?
No.
Okay. So your home was in Pittsfield, you said?
Mm-hmm, Pittsfield.
And you had aunts and uncles who lived there also?
I had an aunt and uncle. My father's family was from Pittsfield, originally from Connecticut, but they owned a women's clothing store in Pittsfield.
And did it later become a specialty kind of store?
Later, my parents started their own store, and they sold coats only.
And of course, I found that to be interesting because here in the South, we wear coats, obviously, but to find a coat store other than a fur coat store would be unusual.
No, in Massachusetts, where it's very cold, you have several winter coats. You have sort of the less cold weather, then you have the down coat. You may have a fur coat, although that's no longer. People aren't wearing those anymore, but you have a multitude of winter coats to get you through the 6 months that it's cold enough for one.
Right, so that was a popular business,
Yes,
I'm sure.
yes.
Did you work in the family business?
By the time they started the store, I was in law school, so I only worked there on, if I was there for Thanksgiving, I'd work the day after Thanksgiving. As a result, I have never shopped Black Friday.
I can understand why, although there are a lot of people who've never shopped that anyway.
Right. I doubt I would shop it to begin with, but having worked that day, I have no interest in shopping.
I understand. That should be a day of rest for
Exactly.
people. So we've talked a little bit about your family. What about growing up? Did you have any summer jobs when you were in high school?
I babysat for a lot back when you made 50 cents an hour. And one summer I made $300 babysitting at 50 cents an hour.
And that seemed like a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not trying to make us sound like, we're 150 years old, but you grew up when? In what era?
I was born in 1956.
Okay.
So this was in the late 60s, early 70s.
And so 50 cents an hour was not great, but it also wasn't horrible either. I mean, I think the minimum wage at that time was something like
$1.65.
So it was less than the minimum wage, but not
terrible.
Yeah.
And then for 2 summers, I was the only female counselor at an all-boys camp.
Now that's interesting. How in the world did you get that job?
Well, we lived across the lake from the camp, and I knew some people there, and they needed somebody to help out at the waterfront. And
did you have some special skills?
I could sailing, water ski. I could teach all of those, canoeing, And so they hired me, and so I did not stay overnight at the camp. It was an overnight camp. I would go home.
You'd go home at
in
night.
the evening. But I got
Which is probably better than having to live in the camp.
Yeah, with all the boys.
Right.
But little boys. But the waterfront director was a wonderful man who was a teacher from Long Island. And he was my parents' age, but he and I got to be very friendly. And then he hired me back the next year. So I did I could start a 60 horsepower motor with the pull cord. I could fix a sail. I could fiberglass a boat. I could do it all.
Do you still do any boating or sailing?
I haven't in a while, although now I do scuba diving.
That's right, and I want to talk about that some more in a minute. So were you the only female who was a counselor then?
Yes.
How'd that feel?
It was fun. I remember talking to one of the older boys, and they were going on a canoeing expedition, and I said, for obvious reasons, I'm not going. And he said, well, why not? And I said, well, because you're all boys, and it probably wouldn't be appropriate. And he said, oh, I forgot that.
Well, that's
I think
good.
the boys forgot that I wasn't like them.
That's good in that they considered you to be their equal, I guess. Yeah, nice. Now, did you also work at Tanglewood?
I did. Tanglewood was about 20 minutes from our house.
Now, just for the oral history, depending on who might be listening to this, there might be a lot of Southerners. Explain to them what Tanglewood is.
Tanglewood is the summer home of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. And when I was young, Leonard Bernstein was at one point the music director, and then Seiji Ozawa, on whom I had a huge crush. He was in his 20s at the time.
Oh, my goodness.
But I was a program girl.
And what is that?
It's a volunteer position, but you handed out programs. And you had to wear white gloves, which got completely black from the programs. My mother used to spend hours bleaching them for me. And on Saturday nights, you had to wear a long dress. And on Friday nights, you had to wear a dress. But you got free admission to Tanglewood all summer.
So no pay, but free admission.
Right.
Did you like that job?
I loved it. The people were really interesting. A lot of people came up from New York to go to Tanglewood. The concerts were fabulous. They have a beautiful lawn. They have a shed and then a lawn. And a lot of people would picnic on the lawn and then have lawn chairs and listen to the music. And the setting was spectacular.
That sounds
so
wonderful.
I really gained an appreciation of classical music through that.
So, college. Where did you go to college?
I went to Williams College.
How did you choose Williams?
It was fairly close to home. I knew several people that had gone there and loved it. And they had just started accepting women. I was in the second class of women as freshmen.
Was that something that had an influence on you based on your summer experience as the only female camp counselor?
Well, a lot of the schools I was interested in had been all male and had recently gone co-ed. So that was, I felt more comfortable with it, I guess, after my summer experiences. But
do you consider that to be a special challenge?
It was very different being in the second class of women in the first group.
So what were the percentages? Do you know?
There 1/3 of the class was women, and this was before Title IX, so they could make decisions based on gender.
Right.
So what happened was the school had had 1,200 total students, 300 in each class, and when they went co-ed, they added 150 to each class, and the 150 were women.
I see.
But Williams did a really smart thing, which was they eliminated fraternities before they went co-ed. So that actually created a better atmosphere.
Ah, interesting. And what did your major in?
History.
At history. Did you start out in something else?
I started out pre-med, and that lasted a semester.
What happened with
I
that?
just blew up in chemistry, and I decided this wasn't for me. So.
Well, that's a lot of people have that experience, and you decided to major in history.
Exactly.
And what were you going to do with your degree in history?
I had no idea. I didn't want to go into banking or investment or business, which was what a lot of people did. I took 2 classes, one on constitutional law and one on civil rights, and I thought, and we had to read cases. And I thought,
it's interesting. In college, you
yeah.
had to do that.
And I thought, this is really interesting. So I decided to apply to law school.
Okay. So those 2 classes were what kind of turned
Yeah.
you toward law school.
Yeah.
And where did you apply for law school?
I only applied to schools in the Southeast.
Why was that?
I just decided it was time to get out of the Northeast. I'd spent my life in the Northeast, and I thought, well, I'll go somewhere for 3 years. I'll see what it's like, and then I'll go back to the Northeast. So I had every intention of being in New York or Washington or Boston.
And where did you go?
Here.
You ended up coming to Vanderbilt, right?
I ended up coming to Vanderbilt
Right.
Law School, but instead of going back to the Northeast right after that, I stayed.
So you came to Nashville at Vanderbilt, and you've stayed ever since.
Yeah.
That's been your home ever since you came here.
Absolutely.
Why was it that you chose Vanderbilt?
Some friends I had come here and had a really good experience.
Did they come to law school or
They
undergrad?
came to law school here. And so that put it on my radar. And then Dent Bostic, who was then the Dean of Admissions, visited Williams, and I interviewed with him, and we got along really well. I really liked him. And he always joked about rescuing me from the Northeast and bringing me south. He took credit.
And you appreciated that, I'm sure.
I did. He and I always got along great.
So now, what was the percentage of your class that were female?
I think it was 17%.
That's amazing. What year was that?
1976.
And it was only 17%. It's hard to look back and think about it being only 17%. So you are now teaching, so you have some familiarity. What is the approximate percentage of females in law school?
50%. And it's nationwide. It runs between 49 and 51%.
So there's been a huge change,
Huge
drastic.
change.
Yeah. I think a lot of women of your era probably experienced similar numbers at the same time. What were your expectations when you came to Vanderbilt and to law school?
I don't know. I thought it would be a fun experience being someplace new.
You thought law school was going to be fun?
No, I thought being in Nashville would be fun.
Okay. Did you find law school to be fun?
I found it very interesting. I didn't know anyone in my class before I started, so I met all sorts of new and interesting people, and I really liked that.
And you're all in the same boat, so that's...
And I discovered the clinic and the Legal Aid Society, and that became my home.
You're not the only person who had experience
I know.
like that. What about the clinic made it your home?
There was a group of students there, probably some of them you've already interviewed, and we hung out there. That's where we studied. We all got engaged in the cases.
So give me some names of some people who you were hanging out with.
Bill
there.
Purcell, Kathy Hinko, who now lives in Louisville.
Of course, Bill Purcell was a lawyer here in town. It was
And
mayor a
mayor,
long
yeah.
time and in the state legislature.
Roy Heron.
Another state legislator. Yeah.
Others have gone to other places, but there was a whole group of us, and we really, Larry Harrington,
Okay.
also a Nashville lawyer. And our mentor was David Kozlowski, who taught in the clinic for 5 years.
Okay. What did you concentrate on any particular thing in the clinic, any particular types of cases?
I did some parole revocation hearings.
Now, at that time, were you able to practice as a third-year student?
Yes, the student practice rule came into effect, I
Just-
think, in the 60s.
Yeah.
And then it was modified in the 90s. Doug Blaze and I worked on modifying it. And then just 2 years ago, it was modified again. The Supreme Court put together a committee that had all the law schools in the state represented, and we once again modified the student practice.
So what is it today?
The student practice rule now allows students to practice after half of law school instead of only in their third year. And there's some requirements. Supervisors at the DA's office, public defender's office, wherever, have to have practiced law for 3 years before they can supervise a student. And then also when the student is admitted to practice, the Supreme Court wants to know where they will be practicing, so they can, if somebody asks, they know who's where.
Keep tabs on them, so to speak.
And also it's changed because now the students get little bar cards,
Okay.
which for my criminal practice students is very helpful because it gets them into the jail to see
Right.
their clients.
Right. That's interesting. But you were able to practice
As a student, yes.
as a student in the third year, I think,
Yes.
right? So you did some parole hearings. Was there any juvenile work that you did?
I did a little bit of juvenile work. Bill Purcell was very involved in that. Kathy Hinko. I did a little bit of that, but not as much.
Uh-huh.
I did more of the criminal side.
So, in terms of jobs, did you work during law school?
The first summer I worked for the member of Congress from my home district, who was our neighbor down the street.
Okay.
I worked in his Washington office, which was a lot of fun.
I bet it was interesting.
It's very interesting. And then the second summer I worked for a law firm, also in D.C., and decided that I really didn't want to work in a law firm. I kind of knew that, but I thought, well, I'll try it out and see, and decided I didn't want to work at a law firm.
Did you decide you didn't want to go to D.C. also?
No, D.C. I loved, but I just wasn't interested in a law firm. So I actually graduated from law school without a job.
Okay. And what was your first job?
Well, I was working for the summer after law school with the public defender's office. Walt Kurtz was public defender. There were only about 9 public assistants in the office.
Walter Kurtz hired a lot of people.
And I was clerking for Mike Engel. And it was a couple of weeks before the bar exam, and David Kozlowski called me and said, you know, there's a new judge on the Court of Criminal Appeals, and I bet you'd like to clerk for him.
And who was that?
Jerry Scott. And I said, And so I got out my typewriter and typed up a letter and sent him my resume.
Did you know Judge Scott?
No, not at all. And he called me and said, would you like to meet with me in a couple of days? This was probably a week before the bar exam now. And I met with him, and a day or two later, he called and offered me a job.
Okay.
And I took
not many
it.
people who get offered their first job that they apply for.
It was pretty exciting.
After applying for it out of the blue.
That actually wasn't the first job I applied for. I applied for a job with Legal Aid
Okay.
and was turned down when it was Legal Services of Middle Tennessee.
Okay.
So,
and we'll talk a little bit more about the irony of regarding legal services later.
And I had applied with the public defender's office, and they hadn't hired anyone, so they kind of put me on hold. They didn't reject me. But yes, this was one of the first jobs I applied for, and so Judge Scott hired me, and I worked for him for a year and very much enjoyed that. It was a lot of fun.
And what did you do when you worked for him?
I reviewed the cases that were scheduled to be heard so that I would give him a bench memo on all the cases. I helped him draft opinions. He liked to draft his own opinions, but I would do some of the research and some of the initial drafting. And I went through all the cases that were issued by the Court of Criminal Appeals so I could start developing a research bank for him. This was before Lexis and Westlaw.
So this is back in the day of
It was a card
Shepard's,
catalog,
right?
Yeah, it was a card catalog that had all the cases in alphabetical order.
That's so like the first computer system. You developed your own little individual computer system.
In a card catalog drawer.
Right. And were these like based on subject matter?
They were, I can't remember.
I'm sure you indexed them some way.
I
so
did,
that
but
you know.
I cannot remember how I did that.
So, I think people who watch this, who knows what they're going to be interested in, but you just explain what Shepard's is, because if they're people who've, are younger members of the bar, they will have no clue what
Okay,
Shepard's
now there is a word called Shepardize on Westlaw and Lexis.
Okay.
And Shepard's and the reason it's called Shepardizing is that there used to be books called Shepard's, and if you had a citation, you went back and you could find out. You had to go through about 5 different volumes to find out whether that case had been cited anywhere
It was
and whether it was still good law. And I still
mind
remember
exploding.
they were red books, and then there were supplements, and you had to go through all of them. Any case you had to Shepardize instead of just hitting the button on the computer and saying, giving you all the cases. So it was
sort of
I
like
don't know
having to walk to school uphill both ways and barefooted.
Yes, except we actually had to do this.
I know.
And we didn't have to walk uphill both ways to school. Students will say something, and I'll ask them to do some research, and they'll come back and say, I didn't find anything. I'll say, did you check the books? And they'll say, what? How?
Do you still have Shepard's?
I don't know. I was just thinking as we said that, I would imagine the law library has them. But I haven't checked in a long time, because I myself use the computer to do that.
Right. And so when you ask your student if they check the cases, do you mean did you check for any updates.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes there are things that are actually contained in books that wouldn't be contained on databases.
That's true. That's true. So, for some unknown reason, things do show up in books that don't show up on the Westlaw or Lexis.
Yes.
So, you worked for Judge Scott. Was he? He's from Middle Tennessee,
Waynesboro.
but not from Nashville.
Right.
Okay. So, did he come into the office every day?
No, he came to Nashville one day a week. So the other 4 days, I got to park in the Supreme Court garage in his parking place,
Nice.
which was very nice. And I had use of the entire office suite, which was 3 offices and a bathroom.
Oh, wow.
And so I would read cases lying on his couch in his office.
Nice. That was a nice setup that you had.
It was a very nice setup. And there was a connecting door to Sissy Daughtry's chambers. So when if I had a question or needed something, I would just pop into her chambers. And there were people there every day because she came in every day and her clerk came in there every day.
Nice. That must have been a really great year that you spent up there.
Yeah.
So what did you do after that?
Vanderbilt was looking for people to teach in the clinic. And Frank Block had been hired as a director the year before. They were looking for 2 people to teach. It was a 1-year sort of renewable contract as an instructor. And they offered the jobs to 2 people whose names I can't remember, but I knew them later. And they decided not to take the jobs. And then they decided to look locally and ended up hiring Andy Shukoff and me.
Well, they certainly did a great job on their second round. Because you were both great lawyers.
But now, when we're doing hiring, there's no way I would hire somebody a year out of law school. But nobody knew what clinical education was at the time. The faculty wasn't that engaged in it because it was brand new. So they were willing to hire me. So I always say to my students, so much of life is being in the right place at the right time.
It absolutely is.
But I knew in law school I wanted to teach in a clinic.
And what did you do during that first year? What kind of cases or what did you work on?
We did criminal cases, a lot in general sessions.
You're somebody who's in the right place at the right time, and you're helping people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yes.
Okay. So you did some criminal work.
I have always taught a criminal practice clinic.
Okay.
I have always done criminal work. In the course of that, we've done some direct criminal representation. We've done some Section 1983 conditions cases. But it's always been focused on the criminal system.
And did you do misdemeanors and felonies, or?
We did, over time now, we do predominantly felonies. The time frame is better for students. They have more time to get ready.
Well, yeah, that's true. There's pace is a little bit slower.
The pace is better.
Right.
For teaching.
Interesting. Did you, you said that you did some direct representation. Was this in state or federal court?
State. I've always done cases in state court.
So was there anything interesting about your practicing in state court doing criminal work at the time?
Very often I would be the only woman up on the 6th floor. If Mariah Wooten wasn't there, I was the only one.
There were very few women in Nashville who were practicing criminal law at that time. Is that right?
Few.
And that would have been about what year?
I started teaching in 1980.
Okay, so in 1980, being on the 6th floor of the courthouse, as you mentioned, Mariah Wooten, was there maybe Andre Lee?
Andre came, I think, a year or 2 later.
Okay.
Mary, blanking on her last name, but she was with the DA's office. But remember, at that time, there were only 10 public defenders.
Right.
The public defender's office was so much smaller than it is now, as was the DA's office.
That's true. Well, there was Joan Hamner, but she was working
She was in juvenile court.
And eventually, I think Sue Ellen Weidman was there.
Yeah, she came in the mid-'80s, I think.
I was there
Pat
for
Newton
a couple
was
of years.
there at the beginning.
Patricia Newton was there, right. So, yeah, it was an unusual thing to do. How did you find that, being one of a handful of women?
Well, when I was in law school, I was advised that I shouldn't go into criminal law because it was too messy for women.
And who advised you of that? Was that another woman who told you that?
No, it was men, of course. And I always joke that but for that advice, I might have ended up doing corporate bond work. But if you tell me I can't do something, I'm going to do it.
Right.
So what I found interesting was in the beginning years, almost all of my students were men. And now I've had semesters when all of the students in my clinic are women. And in fact, this semester, I think I have 5 women and 2 men.
So why do you think that's changed?
More women are going into, a lot of women are going into criminal practice. They find it interesting. I don't know why that is, but
Yeah.
I love it.
That's great. It is interesting. See, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So what were some of your other activities? I'm sorry, let's talk about your job. Did you continue to work at the clinic ever since?
I've worked at the clinic since 1980, so I just finished my 41st year.
And over the years, you've taught a criminal law clinic, and what are some of the other ones?
I also taught a civil rights clinic, in addition to the criminal practice clinic, for about 2 years with Bob Belton.
Uh-huh.
We did 1983 cases. That was great. I've also taught non-clinical courses. I usually teach a clinic and a non-clinical course every year. I've taught professional responsibility. I've taught post-conviction proceedings, and most recently I've taught criminal law, first-year criminal law and evidence. And for example, this fall I'm teaching evidence.
Okay, great. So I'm sure you like the clinical education best because that seems to be your first love.
It is, but what I love about my job is that I get to do both of them. I don't have to choose. At some schools you have to kind of choose which path, but Vanderbilt allows us to do both, which is really
That is a little
exciting.
unusual, I think.
Yeah, and it's fun.
Yeah.
Over the years, the job has changed and gotten more, clinics have taken a more central role in legal education, and the status of clinical faculty has changed dramatically. I mean, I was an instructor, with
Right.
virtually no status. And so nationally, clinicians have developed more status within the academy. In fact, the ABA now requires that every student have 6 credits of experiential education before graduating.
Which is wonderful. I mean, the clinical programs are great. As you can tell, that was something I loved too.
Yeah.
But it really is good to help form a lawyer, give them some.
And it gives students an opportunity to learn in context. So in all their other classes, they're learning law and they're learning doctrine, but they have no idea how that doctrine actually works in practice. And law is not just a doctrine. It involves people and people's lives, and so this allows them to see how is it that the doctrine plays out, how is it that the procedure and the substantive law work together, how do you actually get something that a client needs or wants.
It's like having a residency after you go to med school.
Yeah.
It's allowing them to practice under supervision and knowing what that's like, putting the principles into effect.
Yeah.
So
I had
it's
a student last fall who was a fabulous student. Actually, I think I had her in the spring, but it doesn't matter. And she was a stellar student in the classroom, and she told me that she had been complaining about the 6 credit experiential requirement. Why do we need it? All of her friends had heard over and over, why do we need it? This is ridiculous. And she ended up, in order to get her experiential credit, signing up for clinic. And at the end of the semester, she said to me, I really thought that was a really stupid requirement. But now I can tell you this was the best class I took in law school. It was the most useful class. And I have told everybody else how important it is, and now all my friends are laughing at me for
that must
for
have
having that useless.
Having changed her mind about that.
But I thought that was wonderful, and I was so delighted that she told me that story.
That was rewarding, I'm sure.
It was very rewarding.
Yeah. So aside from your everyday work, did you have some outside activities during the time you've been
Professional
here?
activities I've been...
Well, no, some other kind. Well, we'll talk about those in a minute, but some other activities.
I love to travel. And
Did you play softball?
I played softball with you, Jimmy Lynn. I
Well,
was not one
I
of the
was not
better.
very
I was not
good.
very good. I was.
In fact, I was bad, but
I spent a lot of time on the bench, But we had a team that was sponsored by Shipley and Bem, and Harlan Dotson was the coach. And I watched a lot of softball from the bench. Every once in a while, I got to play second base. I played second base because I couldn't throw from third to first. It was too far for me. But we had a great time.
Yes, we did.
So-
And they were mostly women lawyers who
Yes.
were on the team, except for maybe one or two people, I
Yeah.
think.
But we had a great time.
We did.
We were all young and didn't worry about ruining our knees or our hips or our
Right.
whatever.
Right. And some of the players were actually very good. I mean,
Yes, Mary Walker, Margaret
right,
Bem,
Right.
excellent players.
Marietta was a pretty good player.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were.
All of them were better than I
Well,
was.
th-
But I enjoyed it. I had a good time. I also love scuba diving and do that at least once a year, most of the time more than that.
And you've been to some exotic places.
I took a cruise with Kate Eiler in the South Pacific. And we were in Tahiti, we also went to Bora Bora, and I went diving in every location
That's
on the cruise.
fantastic.
And it was
Of course,
spectacular.
all pre-COVID.
Yeah, oh
because
yeah.
We can't
This
do
was
things like
back
that
in
now.
I think, early 2000s. And I've been to the Philippines, Indonesia, several places in the Caribbean,
Australia.
Australia.
Nice.
So, and I have this year, I'm supposed to be going to Belize in November, and the Philippines again in June, which has spectacular diving.
Well, I hope you'll be able to go. I hope that COVID is
Me too.
out of our minds and in the rearview mirror then.
I hope so.
Yeah. You were involved in some professional organizations. Name some of them.
I have been involved for many years with the ABA section on legal education and admission to the bar, which is the organization that accredits law schools. And I've done...
And you have some important positions and involvement there.
Right now I'm on the council of the section, which is the body, the specific body, the 21 people that decide accreditation matters on law schools.
Right, so you're like the board that
Yeah.
decide, okay.
Yes. And before that I was on the accreditation committee and the standards review committee. I've done...
And this means that you go to schools and visit?
No, but I've also done 14 site visits over the years to law schools. What happens is schools submit information every year, but every 10th year they get visited, and there's a very, picky review to ensure that they're in compliance with the standards.
There's a long checklist, I'm sure.
There's
It's
a
like
long checklist.
accrediting a daycare, except
Yes.
different.
And there's more narrative also, not as much checklist. But as part of that, a team made up of law school faculty, lawyers, judges, go to the school and observe classes, meet with faculty, and see get the information that's needed to make the decisions about accreditation. So I've done a lot of those.
And there's some other ABA committees you're on, or?
Not ABA, but I was on the board of the Clinical Legal Education Association, which is the organization for all clinical faculty members in the country. At the time I was on the board, there were about 600 members. I think there are about 1,000 now.
Oh, my goodness. And you were president at one point.
I was president at one point, I think 2006. And when I started going to clinical meetings, there were maybe 100 of us. We all knew each other. It was a small group. And now it's huge. There are 700, 800 people at these meetings.
Interesting. You've seen a lot of growth over the years, both in the terms of the number of women involved in the legal field and just in terms of the growth of the area that you practice in,
Yes.
you specialize in. Were you involved with Lawyers Association for Women?
I was one of the founding mothers.
And so,
And I was...
again, people watching this may or may not know what LAW is, so if you would tell them.
The Nashville Lawyers Association for Women was founded in 1981, and a group of us got together, and Ramsey Leathers was the clerk of the court. There was no computerized list of lawyers. He had the list of lawyers in the state, and I guess since he has passed away now, it's okay to say he was not allowed to give it out to anybody. But because we were all working as clerks, several of us in the building, he allowed us to take it to our office. And we went through to find out who the women were so that we could send them a letter asking them if they were interested in joining.
Wow. I was a founding member too, and there's some things about it I had forgotten or didn't know at all. So it was fortunate that you had access to these
It was,
lists.
well, and of course, Judge Daughtry, and we would go to her office and go through that list. And that's how we found out who the women lawyers were, because there was no computerized system.
And so you were a founding mother or founding member of the LAW, and what has that organization, why does that appeal to you?
I think it's still an important organization, but it was so important at the beginning. Part of its mission is to make sure that women became judges and had equal opportunity to be in positions of authority, and to support women who wanted to be elected or appointed judges, and to just let women know that there were other women who were having the same issues they were. The glass ceiling was there. It still is. But in 1980, I think there were 1 or 2 women partners at the major law firms in Nashville.
And I think we
in all the law firms.
No female judges in courts of record in Davidson County.
Mm-hmm.
1 Supreme Court justice at the time was Judge Daughtry already.
No, she was on the Court of Criminal
Appeals. So we had no female Supreme Court members. And how many do we have now?
Yeah, none on the Court of Appeals.
How many do we have now?
We have 3.
Yeah.
It's a majority female court.
Yeah.
No district court judges.
And we now have 1 female district court judge, and we have, I can't even tell you how many female circuit court judges and chancery court judges we have now. So it's, I'm not saying that LAW was responsible for all of that, but it has had an impact over the years.
And it was very important at the time, the naming of the organization, the Lawyers Association for Women, because we wanted men who supported the mission of LAW to be engaged and to be members.
And were there male members?
Yes.
And have that's continued on, is it?
Absolutely. But I remember talking about, should it be of, because then it would sound like only women could join, or should it be for? And we decided on for.
It was a big discussion.
It was a big decision, and I think the right decision was made. And those men have been incredibly supportive of the organization.
That's true. And at the time, LAW was the first organization of mainly female lawyers in the state.
In the state.
Subsequently, we now have organizations all across the state,
Mm-hmm.
and there's even an umbrella state organization, too. So times have changed there, too.
Yes.
You've seen a lot of, it's like talking to your grandparents and saying, oh, you've seen the rise of the vehicle and the computers and everything else. Well, as lawyers, you've seen a lot during your career.
Yes.
Which goes back to your original statement about you didn't know why you were here. It seemed like you would never be in this position. You've seen a lot of change over your career.
I have.
Now, you've also been very involved in the ACLU. Is that right?
I was board chair for 10 years.
That's heavily involved.
Yes, and I'm very proud to have received the Lifetime Achievement Award.
And it's well deserved. And the ACLU is very active here in Nashville. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Any notable work that you've participated in while you were president of the ACLU?
Well, not while I was president, but previously, when we were doing the 10 Commandments in courthouses litigation, somebody had agreed to represent the plaintiffs and then wasn't able to, and so I stepped in. And Kent Severud was the dean of the law school, and at the time, there was a lot of political pressure on clinics. A clinician who was working in the University of North Dakota, I think, the dean came out against her representing plaintiffs in a 10 Commandments case. That was public record. And so I talked to Kent Severud, who was our dean, who was a wonderful person and a wonderful dean. And I said, Kent, I'm taking this on not as part of the clinic, but we're allowed to do cases. We have, in a certain percentage of our time, not law school related. And I said, I'm going to do this, and I wanted to tell you to give you a heads up in case there was a problem. And he said, what problem? Of course you should do it. And what can I do to help you?
Great. It's great
And I
that you
just-
had the support of
And,
Vanderbilt.
I just thought here are all these other clinics where the clinicians were getting in trouble for doing public interest work, and there's our law school, which has always been so supportive of the work we do.
Well, and Jim Blumstein, who also teaches at Vanderbilt, is very active in cases both locally and nationally too. So, yeah, Vanderbilt has been supportive of the folks who work there and the causes that they take on, whether conservative or liberal.
Absolutely. And so, it's good to work in a place where there is that support. And I've also been involved with legal aid.
For a long time,
For a long time. I've been on the board for 21 years, I think.
Ironic that you've been on the board for 21 years when they didn't offer you a job.
I know, I've said that to Ashley Wiltshire several times. But I also say to him that not getting the job at legal aid was probably the best thing that ever happened to me.
It seems to have worked out.
Because had I taken the job at legal aid, I probably would have been pretty happy and wouldn't have applied for the job at Vanderbilt. And then my life would have been very different. Who knows? But it's turned out so well.
Right.
I was able to apply for the job at Vanderbilt because I was in a one-year clerkship that was ending. So I'm very grateful to legal aid for not hiring me.
Well, and it's not as if you didn't support their mission.
Oh, absolutely.
But yeah, it's funny how things turn out sometimes.
Yeah, and I've served as board chair of that organization as well.
Now, you also I skipped over LAW. You received an award from LAW too, didn't you?
Oh, Unsung Heroes.
That's a perfect award for someone like you who's done the things that you've done over your career.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, that your work has been public, focused, and centered, and often unrecognized. So it's good that they recognized you for that. Now, you're also a fellow in several organizations.
Of the Nashville Bar,
And?
hence this interview, the Tennessee Bar and the American Bar.
Right. So every organization you're involved in, you've been asked to become a fellow,
Yes.
which is a recognition of your importance to those groups and your work in those groups.
I'm very honored
Yes.
by that.
Now, you're married, is that right?
Actually, we're not married.
Okay, well, you
We've
have a
been
partner.
together for
You have a
25 years.
Long-time partner.
Yes.
And you had there was an interesting way that you all met,
Yes.
I think.
Yes. I was working on it as part of the clinic. My students and I were working on a death penalty case out of Memphis in post-conviction. And the students had pulled together a bunch of medical records for the client. We were trying to establish that the lawyer had been ineffective in failing to present mitigation evidence, because there was no mitigation evidence presented during the penalty phase. And we were trying to get together mitigation evidence to show what could have been. And we had all these records, but of course, none of us were doctors, so we couldn't read them very well. And my co-counsel in Memphis said, "Oh, I have a friend who's a pediatrician, and he will do this for nothing." And I said, "Great." And so this pediatrician reviewed all the records, and in fact, the irony is he was able to get records from the hospitals that they wouldn't give us. We went there with a release from the client, and we got supposedly every record, but Preston was able to go there, and they gave him other records that they hadn't given us because he was a doctor. Anyway, he read all the records and wrote a report, and ultimately the DA decided to agree to a sentence of life imprisonment based on that report.
Wow.
So after he wrote the report, I withdrew from the case at some point. And after I had withdrawn from the case, Preston was driving through Nashville and stopped to visit. And shortly after we got together. So I think we're the only people who met through a death row inmate.
Who've stayed together this long.
Yeah, we've been together almost 26 years.
Yes. Well, and you had a good outcome in the case, too.
Yeah.
So that worked out all the way around.
Yep.
It's clear, based on our conversation, that you love your job, that you love working in the clinic. Other things might have worked out, but you're fortunate that you went down that pathway. What about your job that is it you think that makes you love it so much?
the students.
And why is that?
Because I may have represented hundreds of clients charged with burglary over the years, but this is their first client. And they're establishing their professional identity, and they care so much about the cases. Their worst fear is that they're going to make a mistake that will hurt the client. And just working with them and their enthusiasm and their care and their attention to the clients is just, it renews me constantly.
It's like getting an infusion of energy every year.
It
new
is.
energy.
It is. And every semester we have new students, and I just got a couple of emails from students today saying, I can't wait to start the clinic, and just
that's great. That
makes me feel
it really
happy.
is. Well, I'm sure it does, and as you say, it makes you look forward to the year, and it makes you love your job.
And I'm so proud of where the students have gone and done, and they're just wonderful people.
I'm sure a wide variety of places.
Mm-hmm.
So you've talked a lot about clinical education. Just generally speaking, what would you say about the role of clinical education in a legal education?
I think it's a critical piece. I think what students get out of clinic that they don't, it's important that they learn in the classroom and that they understand law and how law is made and how you think about doctrine and how the process works. But once they learn that, they have to be able to see how it plays out in real life so that they understand not only the doctrine and the procedure, but what we call the theoretics of practice, how lawyers think about a case, and also see how you can use the law to help a client, not just to think about it in the abstract. And in the classroom, they look at law and they're asked to just think broadly, where does this doctrine take you? Just go with it wherever you can. But in a clinic, Tony Amsterdam described it as ends thinking lawyering, where you have a goal in mind and you're trying to use the law to get to that goal as opposed to just thinking about it as an abstract doctrine.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. So what are your thoughts on retirement?
Well,
so now that we're sitting here doing your oral history.
I have no intention of retiring anytime soon.
So maybe we'll do another oral history in another 10 years.
Well, who knows? But I'm not one of those people that thinks I'm going to work until I can't see anymore, can't do the job. But at this point, I still enjoy the job. I like to think that I still have something to offer. And at some point I'll probably feel that I don't have the energy to do it as well, or that I am not, that it's not, that I'm just not up to it anymore. And at that point I will retire. But at this point I still think...
It doesn't sound like it's coming anytime soon.
No. I plan on being there for several more years.
Well, and you may decide you want to further your love of diving, and you also have another love, I think, that goes way back to your roots in Boston.
The Red Sox. I love the Red Sox, although right now...
Who doesn't love the Red Sox?
Although right now they're making it hard again to love them. But yes, if the Red Sox-Yankees are playing, I will be in front of the television watching them.
That's great.
There's the joke that the Red Sox fans like two teams, the Red Sox and whoever's playing the Yankees.
Right.
And I find that to be true. But yeah, there are a lot of things I plan to do in retirement, but at this point, the job I travel with the job. I have a year that's cyclical that makes it interesting. The summer, I'm still working, but it's different than the school year. So there are a lot of reasons that make it...
So it gives you some flexibility to still continue to travel and do the diving that you love to do. And you have some diving planned, obviously.
Yeah. So it's still fun.
It sounds like just a wonderful place to have been and to still be there. What do you want to be remembered for?
When people think about me, I don't want them to only focus on me as a lawyer. I want kids that I knew to think of me as somebody fun to do things with.
Well, and
That I loved the Red Sox.
speaking of kids that you do things with, don't you have some godchildren?
I have 4 godchildren who are now adults.
You told me a really interesting story about trips that you...
Yeah, for each of their bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, I took them on a trip. And I took one to Paris, one to Costa Rica.
Yeah, these were big trips.
Yeah.
It's not like going
one to Alaska and
Memphis.
one to Hawaii. Yeah.
Right.
And it was so much fun, and they're all in the same family. And what I loved about it was it allowed me to get to know each of them individually, because I spent time just with one of them. You know, because usually when I'd go visit the family, they'd all be there. And so everybody said, oh, that was so generous, it was so wonderful for them. But it was so wonderful for me. And 2 of them actually asked me to officiate at their weddings.
So clearly there are
was
things you'll be remembered
the
for
most-
other than being a lawyer.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, being a lawyer is good, but I don't want that to be the only thing.
The
people
only
remember.
defining quality. Well, that's good. Is there anything that I should have asked you about your career or your time in Nashville that you think should be memorialized here?
We've had a series of really wonderful dogs, Preston and I.
Okay, well,
So,
tell me about the dogs.
We had a dog named Fenway, who lived to be almost 19.
Of course you did.
Who was given to us by Judge Scott. She was a stray that he found wandering in Waynesboro.
Okay.
And gave her to us. And then we had Amadeus, who we acquired from my then cleaning woman, who I later found out was stealing my jewelry. But that's a whole other story.
Probably
and then,
not something we should include on the oral history.
No.
Okay.
And then we just adopted a rescue named Isaac, who's a mostly pit bull.
And where did the name Isaac come from?
Preston named him after Isaac Newton, although changed the spelling to Izyk. Go figure.
Okay. Just to keep it interesting.
So no children, but we do have dogs.
Right, right. Okay. Well, this has been, a lot of fun, probably more fun for me than it is for you to do this. I've known you a long time. Well, I've known you since you were a law student.
Yes.
But it's fun to reconnect and remember parts of your history because I've known about a lot of it. But this has been a great fun. And
Well, it's
I'm
been fun
hoping-
for me. Thank you for volunteering to do this. I know it's a lot of work.
Good. Well, it's fun work, so glad to do it. Glad to do it. Thanks.
Thank you.